below a point where the engine RPM came down to about 85%. And that was pretty high thrust, and it didn't make flying the airplane any easier. We had to pass that throttle bar on into service, and we also had to obviously instruct the flight crews in service as to how to deal with it. They didn't like it, and they realized we needed it. But that story as to how it was handled in flight, I think, it's much better handled by someone who actually had to fly it, and that is Jim and John at the other end of the table. So I'll let them go ahead and talk about that. But that's something of the background that we ran into with that major engine problem right at the beginning of the program.
Next up, to give us a perspective on what it was like to fly the 747, especially on the early models when they were introduced, we have an elite, steely-eyed pilot who was one of the first to fly the jumbo jet. With 39 years experience flying 747s, he is absolutely an expert on the airplane. Here is Mr. Jim Lindy.
Thank you. Barry, I'll talk about the throttle bar in a minute, but you notice those pictures there. This was the result of flying Barry's engines. You know, there's actually only a year's difference between the guy at the top and the guy at the bottom. After I ended up shutting down 10 of Barry's engines there in about the first year that I was on that airplane. But first, I'll give you a little information about how I ended up in the aviation in the first place. I was in college in Bozeman, Montana, AFROTC, Advanced Cadet in ROTC. I was planning on going into the Air Force and flying in the Air Force. I passed the necessary tests and physicals for the Air Force. Northwest Airlines came to our campus and interviewing for pilots. This was 1966, and the Vietnam War was going strong, so there's a shortage of pilots for the Air Force, and also the airlines were growing like crazy, hiring jet pilots, and they needed pilots pretty bad. So I interviewed with Northwest Airlines, and I passed their interview, and they said, get your licenses and come to Minneapolis, and we'll put you to work. So I quit college, borrowed the money, and got on to Northwest Airlines 6 months later with about 187 hours of experience. Now that would never happen in today's world. I'm sure Ann has a great deal more experience when she started than I did. But in those days, I was interviewed by people who were World War II pilots, and I would suspect that they were 90-day wonders, so they probably looked at me and thought, well, he looks pretty much like I did. I think he can probably handle the job. So through the 60s, I flew the Lockheed Electra 727 and the 707, and my first experience with the 747 came in 1971, which is about a year after we had the airplane. I think we had a strike after we purchased the airplane. Northwest did a lot of strikes in those days. And so in 1971, I got on the airplane, and the airplane was brand new. The transition to the airplane is pretty interesting from the 707. Most of the training on the 747 was done in the simulator with tape that they use for visual. And then the first time you saw the airplane was prior to passenger flights in those days. You had to go out and actually fly the real airplane in Rochester, Minnesota, generally. So you get in there and you look out, and you would not realize how high you are above the ground compared to the 707. That was pretty scary to look out that front window and just see how high you are. If you take a look at that picture of either the young guy or the old guy there, if you look on the window wall, in fact, I'll turn around here, excuse me a minute. Right there and there. you'll see what Boeing put in there for seat adjustment, so you have the proper picture looking out the front of the airplane. And the idea of that is you put your seat forward and high, and your nose, as you turn your head, your nose should be right on that X. And that means you have the right proper sight picture so you can see when to flare the airplane so you don't do a hard landing. So everybody did that, and I think everybody still does that. It feels a little bit too far forward and too high, so usually after you're in the air, of course, you slip your seat back. Also, to help with the flare on the airplane, there was a set of tones, and there still are a set of tones in there, a 50 and 20-foot tone that you'll hear on landing. That comes from the radar or radio altimeter. The radio altimeter will put out a tone of a beep, beep, and that's about the way you should hear that on landing. So when it goes beep, beep, and that's about right, you'll make a nice landing out of it. If it goes beep, beep fast, you better pull back because you're going to probably make a hard landing. So when you're first on the airplane, you pay very good attention to that set of tones until after a while you get so it's not any different than any other airplane. It's you look out and you don't even hear the tones anymore after 4 or 5 landings on that airplane. The airplane is extremely nimble. You don't have any problem with as far as maneuverability. It looks like a big lummox, flying around in the air. But once you fly the airplane from the cockpit, you kind of forget just how big it is behind you. And it's very nimble flying around. And also, taxiing is really easy. As the nose gear steering, of course, you have the tiller, nose gear steering for turning one way or the other. But as you turn the nose gear steering, the body gear steering then turns the other direction. And the airplane slides around without scrubbing tires. Excellent. I don't know how they did all that and thought it out, but the DC-10, which I flew sometime later, was you actually it was harder to steer on the ground. Barry was talking about the throttle bar. The throttle bar we did use, and it is basically a Band-Aid, pretty much like he was saying, for the engines. The engines were extremely touchy. Anytime you were trying to start a descent, you never knew for sure whether you could get the engine back to idle or not without losing one. And as I said, I had lost 10 of them for that purpose. So the throttle bar, what happened was that on climb out, around 25,000 feet, we would pick that up and slide it over. And what that would do is it would prevent you from bringing the engines all the way back to idle on descent. Well, that's not great, because if you're at cruise altitude of 35,000 feet with the throttle bar over and you have an emergency descent or something like that, you can't get the engines all the way to idle to have a high rate descent. So we had a procedure where we would just, if we were to have something unusual happen, like a high rate descent, an emergency descent, or a depressurization or something, we'd move that throttle bar over and bring them back to idle anyway, and hope for the best on those engines. I was involved in 3-engine ferries on the 747. I'll go back and through the 1970s, I flew off and on the DC-10 and 747 through the 70s, checked out as captain in 1980, and then 1985 flew the 757, 767, and 1989 checked out as captain on the 747, and also instructor and check airman on that particular airplane. 1991 I checked out on the 747-400 and finished up my career on the 747-400. I used to do 3-engine ferries on the 747-400, which is kind of an interesting procedure. 747 engines are extremely expensive, so an airline will not have them around except a very few spots on their system. Northwest had 747 engines in Detroit, Minneapolis, and Tokyo. And my involvement was generally I did 3 flights from Amsterdam to Detroit, bringing the airplane back. 3-engine takeoff. To do one of those, you have to assume that the worst thing will happen to you at the worst time, which is the loss of the second engine on rotate. So you adjust your gross weight downwards as light as possible, assuming that you're going to lose the second engine on takeoff. And also, just due to rudder capabilities, you can't really use all 3 engines on takeoff, or you shouldn't, because it puts too much stress on the nose gear. So our procedure was to accelerate on 2 engines. So we'd start with the 2 symmetrical engines first, and we'd accelerate to a speed which is called DMCG, which you really don't need to know, but it is the speed where the rudder has effectiveness, which is about 120 knots. So you put the symmetrical engines up. When you hit 120 knots, then you brought in the 4th engine smartly and speedily and completed your takeoff. And due to the light weight, because you want that speed to be as low as possible, you have a lightweight, light fuel load, so then consequently you would probably, in the Amsterdam to Detroit case, you'd land in Gander, Newfoundland, and refuel at Gander on the way back. I'll move ahead one slide. Some of the interesting airports. There's one. Okay, everybody has probably seen or heard of the landing in Kai Tak Airport, or the old Hong Kong airport, runway 13, which for me is probably, I flew Hong Kong all I could, because I just loved that approach. It's the only time you get to turn the airplane. And most of the time it's cruising straight and level, and this is an exciting approach. So when you go out to the dispatch in Tokyo, I'd always ask the dispatcher, well, what are they landing on in Hong Kong? And he'd say, well, they're doing the Charlie approach, which is the 1 to 1-3, the exciting one. So I would spend that whole 4 or 5 hours going to Hong Kong getting ready for the approach, just thinking about it in my mind. Let's see now, what are we going to do here? And the approach is, generally the weather is pretty good when you do that approach, because the last half of it has to be visual. So you start out in instrument conditions out at either Charlie, which is Cheng Chow, and that is the final approach fix. Later on, it was at Green Island. We started out at Green Island, and it was a little shell work. And this guy here is Korean Airline. He started at Green Island, because that's a later picture of the checkerboard. So you start there, and you start your instrument approach, and you do your letdown, and as you're flying in, you'll be looking out, waiting to see that checkerboard. And when you saw the checkerboard, then you knew you had minimums for landing. And you do your turn, and steeply first, because when you make your landing into Hong Kong, you want to make sure that you're lined up early. So you make a real steep turn, just pretty much like this guy. I'd even steepen that out a little bit more than what he has there. But when you see that checkerboard, then you should be heavily into your turn. And then once you get settled at the runway, you have to overshoot the runway slightly, because you almost always have a crosswind landing coming from right to left, so you're going to end up being blown off to the left of the runway if you're not careful. So you keep that thing crabbed and coming in quickly. And also there's a tendency, you're coming right over those buildings, which if you've seen that on the internet, you know that the buildings are just right there. So you have a tendency to come in a little high. Don't want to do that. Just come in and bring it in as close as you can to those buildings without hitting them, obviously. And then you'll make your landing. I'll turn on here one more shot. Here's the guy. Now he's lined up about right. It looks to me like he already overshot a little bit because he's turned back. You also notice that there's a takeoff. Now that is an error, I would say, on the ground people, the tower control. They should not have cleared that guy for takeoff when this guy is right in the middle of flying. But I tell you what, he has no choice right now but to land. And that is because if he goes around, that plane that's taken off, they're going to meet out there, and that's the Czech-Lap-Cock as the gap that's out there. They're going to meet in the gap. So this guy is going to land, that's British Airways, and he'll be landing there even though the other guy is probably still just lifting off of the runway. So that's pretty much what I have to say, and pass this on.
Our next panelist, a gentleman who has had an amazing career of flying. 40 years with Pan Am. He flew flying boats such as the S-44, the PBM, the PBY. He also flew Connies, Stratocruisers, the Douglas propliners, and on to Boeing jets. So here to talk about the introduction of the 747 into service, and from the interesting perspective of the flight engineer, is John Anderson.
Thank you. I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here. Kind of getting up in the years now, and it's a good chance to get back and talk about some of the good old days. Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I apologize for not wearing my uniform, but frankly, it's a little moldy at this point. So I did fly 40 years with Pan Am, and then I retired and sat around about 8 months. And somebody called me one day and said, "Would you like to fly again?" And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm still qualified. And so I flew for O&A on a Hodge charter, bringing the Arabs up to Mecca there for 1 or 2 flights. And at that time, there was a new airline starting called Tower Air. And Tower Air asked me if I would like to join them, so I went with them, and I flew for them for 15 and a half years after that. So it was well over 50 years I've been flying, and I enjoyed every minute of it. In the process of going through all these years, I ended up with special projects, which of course is an awful lot of fun. It really is. It's so interesting. You go to the manufacturers of different components, and you go to school and you do design work and help out on a lot of projects like that. I was very fortunate on that, even to the extent of getting to fly the Concord a couple of 3 times. Anyway, when it came time to get the 747, about 2 years before we got it, was asked if I would join a team to kind of study over the cockpit and design and see if we could make it more usable and friendly for everybody. And so I got involved in that and enjoyed that work quite a bit. One of the things that came up, the 707s, they'd come out with engine instruments that were smaller than the ones on this airplane, and a little hard to differentiate between 2 points like 30 and 31 and so forth. So I worked on the thing, and I figured out that with the size they would allow us to have 1/4-inch digits on a rotating drum for the numbers. Pan Am took it to Boeing, and Boeing said, well, it cost you $50,000. Well, I thought we were shot down on that, but by golly, Pan Am backed me up on it, and so we bought our airplanes with that, and when that happened, all the other airlines got to look at it and decided they liked it too, so in the end, we got that presented. It was part of the cost of the airplane. Of course, the money's in there somewhere. Let's face it. The engine, I was involved in writing up the section for the ops manual, and therefore spent some time at Pratt & Whitney. And a lot of time on the drawing board and so forth. So I had a feel for the engine before we got it. I didn't do any flying on the airplane itself, though, until a little after we started the inaugural flights. One of the things that came up, as has been talked about, is the engine stalls that were occurring on this engine. The Pratt & Whitney guys did a great job of building an engine, but it just wasn't quite ready to hit the big market when they were doing this testing. So they had different models of the engine, over about 3 different models before we even got the airplanes. And still, there was a problem with engine stalls. The throttle bar that Jim had mentioned before was for high altitude work, but on the ground, just making a turn, crosswind sometimes would cause an engine to stall at idle to start with. As a matter of fact, Pan Am's inaugural flight on this airplane was a big event, news-wise around the world almost. And doggone if they didn't taxi out for takeoff, and they turned to go onto the runway, and an engine overheated. They had to come back, and the engine had to be changed. Fortunately, the number 2 airplane that Pan Am had at the time was available, so the airplane went ahead and made the trip. But that's how, just one case of where this stall occurred. It was a hard thing to try to lick on this stall characteristic, and it's been discussed. Barry does a wonderful job of describing the engine. I learn something from him every time he talks. At this point, I'd just like to take a moment, and I see that we've got some people I know in the audience here that I've worked with over the years, and one of which, a man that I respect very much, is Mr. Bob Blake. And Bob was the operations engineer at Kennedy Airport for several years, quite a few years, and he also was the rep out here at Boeing for the Boeing 747 airplanes when they came out. So he is really knowledgeable on this airplane. I'm glad that he and his wife Mary could make it today. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the thrust level that the engine was at when we got the airplane. Jim discussed very well. It was really hardly adequate. In fact, by golly, it wasn't adequate. So they had to take thrust reductions depending on temperature of the day long before they really wanted to. And so Pratt & Whitney worked very hard in trying to give us an engine with more thrust. And one of the things you could do is to add water injection to the engine. Everybody that's played around with hot rods and so forth know that you can use water injection on an engine in a car too, but a very different principle. Here we have capacity for 700 gallons of water in the center wing section, and on the start of the takeoff, when the captain got up to where he put the throttles just another little bit further, water injection started, and they would put water in the back end of the engine at the turbine section, and what that did was to add a mass, the mass of water at 8 pounds per gallon, in great quantities, which added to the thrust. It also reduced the temperature so that you could push the throttle up a little further, and you get more thrust that way. So you got thrust out of it. Then you could add water up at the front of the compressor section, which simply added the mass weight to the water, and you got a little extra takeoff thrust. Now, this was all real good when everything worked right, and it did most of the time. The only problem was that every time you made a brand new engine, you used a brand new engine and you used water injection, it never was quite as efficient again as it was to start with. And the reason for that is when you get up to high powers and the temperatures are getting pretty high on the case and the turbine blades, and you add water, the engine case shrinks slightly onto the turbine blades, and it takes off the knife edge around there so that the leakage around the end is going to cause some inefficiency. That's not what you want to have happen, but that's what we had to live with for the first year of operation, basically, on the airplane. The water injection system was, had a pump for each engine. And on the 707s, they had the same thing. And when the water would run dry and the airplane was cocked up, first one pump would go dry and the airplane would go this way a little bit, and the other pump would go dry, the other way. This one, they had each pump there were individual pumps for the engines, so it worked out much better in that regard. The other problem with the water injection was that as pure as that water was supposed to be, and it was supposed to be as pure as you could get water because the chemicals building up inside the engine using it continuously, some dirt and debris would stick to the blades in the front when they were using front water injection, and on the turbine blades as well. Even though as hot as they ran, they would collect some of this material. And so they developed a way of cleaning those blades to make them more efficient, and it was to use walnut shells. So they would stand out in front of the engine, run it, and blast it with walnut shells to clean the blades off. It didn't take them long to figure out that that was a very poor way to work that. And anyway, the water injection system died out after about the second iteration of the engines, with Pratt & Whitney was working furiously on the Boeing's tremendous pressure to get this thing going. The airplane was amazing in the error that it would take in computations of weight and other conditions that might fit in, like the wind velocity and this, that, and the other. And I'm just going to mention one case, which is true confessions, I guess. But one of our freighters went through Venezuela, and he was supposed to offload a whole batch of material in the lower cargo compartment. It was a freighter, so the main deck was full of equipment too. Somehow they misfitted and they did not unload that belly. So when the airplane took off, the pilot said, kind of slow getting off here, having a little trouble, you know. And they climbed on up, and it was quite a difference in the climb time. When they finally got to Miami and figured out the deal, they had taken off 100,000 pounds heavier than they thought they were. It just shows how much of a forgiving airplane it was.
Wow.
Well, I think I'll let it go at that. I believe I've talked about it in 15 minutes. And if you have questions,